Let me be honest with you right now. Your grandmother knew things that no cooking school on earth would ever teach you. She didn't have a choice. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, black families across the American South and in cramped urban neighborhoods up north were already surviving conditions that the rest of the country was just beginning to experience. See, economic devastation wasn't new to black communities. They had been navigating poverty, scarcity, and systemic exclusion for generations. So when the Depression hit, Big Mama didn't panic. She reached into a deep well of inherited knowledge, community strategy, and pure ingenuity, and she fed her family every single day. Today we are counting down 35 of the most brilliant, practical, and historically accurate cooking tricks that black grandmothers used during the Great Depression era to stretch food, preserve nutrition, and keep entire families alive. These aren't general tips you'll find in any cookbook. These are specific to the black community, rooted in the traditions of Southern black households, sharecropper families, and the Great Migration neighborhoods where resourcefulness wasn't a hobby. It was survival. Let's get into it. Number 35. Saving every drop of pot liquor. When Big Mama boiled collard greens, mustard greens, or turnip greens, she never threw away that dark, rich liquid left behind in the pot. She called it pot liquor, and she treated it like liquid gold. She would pour it into a jar, store it in the icebox, and use it as a base for soups to cook cornbread in or to sip straight from a cup when someone felt sick. Pot liquor is packed with vitamins and minerals that leach out of the vegetables during cooking, especially iron, folate, and vitamin C. In a time when nutrition was scarce, this liquid was genuinely life-saving, not just flavorful. Number 34. Stretching ground meat with cooked rice. When meat was available, Grandma never cooked it plain. She would mix a small amount of ground pork or beef with a large volume of cooked white rice before forming patties, stuffing peppers, or making a meatloaf. 1 pound of meat could easily feed 8 people this way. The rice added bulk, absorbed the fat and seasoning from the meat, and made every bite satisfying. This is also why dishes like stuffed bell peppers became such a staple in black Southern households. You were getting protein and carbohydrates in one affordable filling package. Number 33. Using fatback and salt pork to season everything. Black families during the Depression rarely had the luxury of buying fresh cuts of meat regularly. Instead, they kept a piece of fatback or salt pork in the house at all times. A small chunk would go into beans, greens, cornbread batter, or a pot of field peas. The fat rendered out during cooking, coating every ingredient with rich, smoky flavor while also adding calories. In a period of food scarcity, calorie-dense cooking was not indulgent, it was necessary. The salt in the pork also helped preserve other ingredients it came into contact with, giving those dishes a slightly longer shelf life. Number 32. Making crackling cornbread from leftover lard scraps. When Big Mama rendered hog fat to make lard, the crispy little bits of pork skin left behind were called cracklings. She never threw them away. Instead, she folded them directly into her cornbread batter. Those cracklings added protein, fat, texture, and deep savory flavor to what would otherwise be a plain bread. This trick also meant that one single hog could contribute to multiple meals across multiple days. Nothing from that animal was ever wasted, including the scraps of scraps. Number 31. Stretching coffee with chicory root. Real coffee was expensive and often not available to black families in the rural South. Grandma would dry chicory root, roast it in a cast iron skillet, grind it, and mix it with whatever small amount of real coffee she had. Chicory has a naturally bitter, slightly woody flavor that mimics coffee closely enough to make the blend feel satisfying. New Orleans black communities in particular became famous for this practice, which is why chicory coffee is still culturally significant in Louisiana today. This was not a trend, it was a necessity turned tradition. Number 30. Making vinegar pie when there was no fruit. Fresh fruit was seasonal and often inaccessible. When Grandma wanted to make a pie but had no apples, peaches, or berries, she reached for apple cider vinegar. She combined it with sugar, eggs, butter, and a little flour to create a custard-style filling with a sweet and tangy flavor profile that genuinely resembled lemon pie. Vinegar pie was a common dessert in poor black households across the South during the 1930s. The acidity of the vinegar balanced the sweetness of the sugar in a way that made the pie taste complex and intentional, not like a desperate substitute. Number 29. Curing and smoking meats to avoid refrigeration costs. Ice was expensive, and ice boxes were a luxury many black families could not afford consistently. So Grandma cured her own meats using salt, sugar, black pepper, and sometimes a little red pepper. After rubbing the meat thoroughly, she would hang it in the smokehouse or near a wood stove for days. Smoking created an antimicrobial surface layer on the meat that prevented bacterial growth. Salt drew out moisture that bacteria needed to survive. This is the science behind why smoked hams and salted pork could sit without refrigeration for months. It was chemistry disguised as tradition. Number 28. Using stale bread to make breakfast pudding. Old bread that had gone completely hard was never discarded. Big Mama would tear it into chunks, soak it overnight in a mixture of eggs, milk, sugar, vanilla, and nutmeg, then bake it in the morning. The result was bread pudding, a breakfast or dessert that used ingredients most families had on hand even during lean times. Stale bread actually works better than fresh bread for this recipe because it absorbs the liquid mixture without falling apart. The firmer texture holds up to baking and creates a more structured, sliceable pudding. Number 27. Rendering chicken fat for cooking oil. In households where buying cooking oil or lard was a strain on the budget, Grandma would save all the fat trimmings from chicken and render them slowly in a cast iron pan over low heat. The resulting golden chicken fat, known in some communities as schmaltz, could be used to fry eggs, saute onions, season cornbread pans, or baste roasting meats. Nothing about a chicken was wasted in these kitchens. The fat, the bones, the feet, the neck, the giblets, every single part contributed to the family's food supply. Number 26. Making flour sack clothes and flour sack dish towels. This one crossed into cooking because it directly related to how Grandma managed her kitchen resources. Flour came in printed cotton sacks during the Depression era, and black grandmothers figured out that those sacks could be repurposed as dish towels, aprons, and even children's clothing. Clean dish towels mattered for food safety and for straining liquids when making cheese, juices, or broths. Rather than spending money on cloth, she recycled the packaging her flour came in. Flour companies eventually caught on and started printing prettier patterns specifically because of how widely this practice had spread in poor communities. Number 25. Stretching flour with cornmeal. When wheat flour ran low, and it ran low constantly, black grandmothers would never simply stop baking. They would blend whatever flour remained with cornmeal to stretch it further. A recipe that normally called for 2 cups of plain flour might get made with 1 cup of flour and 1 cup of cornmeal instead. This produced a slightly denser but completely edible product, and cornmeal was far more accessible in southern black households because many families grew their own corn or could purchase cornmeal cheaply from local mills. Cornmeal was black southern kitchen currency. It was always there when everything else ran out. Number 24. Using overripe bananas and bruised fruit immediately. In Depression-era black households, produce was bought from vendors or grown in home gardens, and nothing was allowed to go bad without purpose. When bananas turned fully brown or fruit developed soft spots, Grandma did not compost them. She mashed them into cake batter, stirred them into oatmeal, or made a quick stovetop jam by cooking them down with sugar and a pinch of cinnamon. Overripe fruit is actually sweeter than fresh fruit because starches have converted to sugars, which means you needed less added sugar in recipes, stretching the sugar supply further. Number 23. Making syrup from watermelon rinds. Watermelon was a summer staple in black communities across the South, and the entire fruit was used. The rind, which most people discard, was transformed into 2 separate products. The white inner rind was pickled with vinegar, sugar, and spice to create watermelon rind pickles, a condiment that lasted months in jars. The green outer skin was sometimes boiled down with sugar to make a thick syrup used on pancakes, biscuits, and porridge. Zero waste from a single fruit, and 2 entirely different preserved foods created from what would have been trash. Number 22. Making hominy from dried corn using lye water. Black grandmothers in the rural South knew how to process dried corn using wood ash. Lye water in a technique rooted in African and indigenous food traditions. Soaking dried corn in lye water caused a chemical reaction called nixtamalization that removed the outer hull, increased the corn's nutritional value significantly, and made it easier to digest. The resulting hominy could be cooked whole, dried, and ground into grits or fried in patties. This single technique transformed a nutritionally limited grain into a more complete food source during a period when variety was impossible to afford. Number 21. Keeping a perpetual soup pot on the wood stove. Big Mama kept a large pot on the back of the stove that never fully emptied. Every day she added whatever was available: leftover bones, wilting vegetables, small bits of meat, cooked beans, and cornbread crumbles. The pot simmered constantly, and the contents changed daily. This is the original version of what modern chefs call bone broth soup, and it worked because the continuous heat kept the soup safe while the layering of ingredients built a progressively deeper and more complex flavor. Monday's chicken became Tuesday's chicken vegetable soup became Wednesday's thick stew automatically. Number 20. Using dried hot peppers to make food more filling. This sounds counterintuitive, but hear it out. Grandma would cook beans, greens, and soups with dried red pepper pods and cayenne because spicy food triggers a slower eating pace, causes drinking more water, and creates a feeling of fullness that lasts longer. Hot peppers also contain capsaicin, which has a mild, appetite-suppressing effect. When you cannot cook large portions, making people feel full on smaller amounts is a genuine survival strategy. It also masks the monotony of eating the same simple foods repeatedly, making each meal feel more stimulating and satisfying. Number 19. Making peanut soup and peanut stew. Peanuts were a major crop in the black agricultural South, and black families had deep familiarity with using them as a food beyond snacking. Long before peanut butter became a mainstream American product, black grandmothers were grinding peanuts into paste and stirring them into soups and stews to add protein, fat, and thickness. Peanut stew with sweet potato and greens was both nutritionally dense and incredibly filling. A handful of peanuts could transform a thin broth into a substantial meal for a large family. This tradition connects directly to West African groundnut stew, keeping that culinary lineage alive through generations of forced displacement. Number 18. Pickling everything that grew in the garden. During summer and fall, when garden vegetables were plentiful, Big Mama pickled aggressively. Cucumbers, okra, green tomatoes, peppers, snap beans, beets, cabbage, and even green peaches went into mason jars with vinegar, salt, sugar, and spices. The pickling brine preserved vegetables for winter when nothing grew and fresh produce was unavailable. Beyond preservation, pickled vegetables added acid and brightness to heavy, starchy meals, which helped with digestion and made monotonous food feel more varied. A jar of pickled okra on a dinner table transformed a plain meal into something with personality. Number 17. Making hand soap from pork fat and wood ash lye. This crosses from cooking into household management, but it mattered for kitchen hygiene and food safety. Big Mama would combine rendered hog fat with lye water made from wood ash to produce a crude but effective soap for washing hands, dishes, and kitchen surfaces. Clean hands and surfaces mean fewer illnesses spreading through the family, which meant fewer people too sick to work or eat. Food safety and cooking efficiency are directly connected, and this zero-cost soap kept the kitchen sanitary without requiring a trip to the store. Number 16. Drying herbs, peppers, and onions for year-round flavor. Fresh herbs and vegetables had a short season, and Grandma was not going to let that stop her from cooking with flavor 12 months a year. She would hang bundles of sage, thyme, and green onion tops in a warm, dry corner of the kitchen or porch. Dried hot peppers were threaded onto string and hung by the wood stove. Onions braided together by their dried tops could last for months in a cool spot. Dried herbs are actually more concentrated in flavor than fresh ones, so smaller amounts achieve the same seasoning effect, making those dried herbs last even longer. Number 15. Making sweet potato pie instead of pumpkin pie. Sweet potatoes grew abundantly in southern soil, required minimal maintenance, stored well in root cellars for months, and were rich in vitamins A, C, and B6. Grandma used them as a substitute for nearly every recipe that called for a more expensive or seasonal ingredient. Sweet potato pie used the same custard filling technique as pumpkin pie, but with a deeper, richer, more naturally sweet base that required less added sugar. The sweet potato itself provided enough natural sweetness and body that the filling was more forgiving and more flavorful than a comparable pumpkin version. Number 14. Using fried chicken grease as a flavor base all week. After Sunday fried chicken, the skillet was never washed clean. The rendered chicken fat and drippings left in the cast iron were kept at room temperature in the skillet, covered with a clean cloth and used throughout the week to fry eggs, brown onions, start gravies, and season cornbread pans. This practice sounds alarming by modern food safety standards, but in a Depression-era kitchen with limited fuel and limited ingredients, that accumulated flavor was a resource. The salt and heat from regular use of the skillet kept it relatively safe, and the flavor it added to every subsequent dish was irreplaceable. Number 13. Making fried salt pork and gravy over biscuits is a complete meal. When there was almost nothing in the house, Grandma could still make a meal from salt pork, flour, and a little milk or water. She would slice and fry the salt pork until crispy, then deglaze the pan with water or milk, whisk in flour, and cook until a thick gravy formed. Poured over homemade biscuits, this meal provided fat, protein, carbohydrates, and enough calories to carry a working adult through a long day. It required almost no fresh ingredients and could be made in under 20 minutes, which mattered when time was as scarce as money. Number 12. Fermenting vegetables in crocks. Before commercial canning became widely accessible in poor Black communities, fermentation was the primary preservation technique. Big Mama would pack sliced cabbage tightly into a ceramic crock, add salt, weigh it down with a heavy plate, and let it ferment at room temperature for several days to weeks. The resulting sauerkraut or fermented collards lasted through winter and provided beneficial bacteria that supported gut health and immune function. Fermented foods also have a complex, deeply savory flavor that made plain dishes taste like they took more effort than they did. Number 11. Making hoe cakes when there was no oven. A wood-burning oven required a significant amount of fuel, and not every family could afford to fire it up daily. Grandma solved this with hoe cakes, flat cornbread patties mixed from just cornmeal, water, a little salt, and sometimes a spoonful of lard, then cooked directly on a hot cast-iron griddle over an open flame or wood stove top. The name comes from the historical practice of cooking these cakes on the flat blade of a gardening hoe over a field fire. They cooked in minutes, required minimal fuel, and provided the same carbohydrate and calorie content as a full pan of baked cornbread. Number 10. Stretching milk with water and calling it drinking milk. Fresh whole milk was rationed carefully. Big Mama would dilute it significantly with clean water for the children to drink, while keeping the richer, undiluted portion for cooking custards, gravies, and puddings, where the fat content mattered for texture. This made a small amount of milk go twice as far. Children received the hydration and some nutritional benefit from diluted milk, while the household still managed to prepare recipes that technically required dairy. It was logistics disguised as cooking. Number 9. Making a full meal from chicken feet. Chicken feet were the cuts that nobody else wanted, which made them extremely cheap or free from butchers. Black grandmothers knew exactly what to do with them. After scorching the feet over flame to remove the outer yellow skin, she would simmer them for hours in seasoned water with onion, garlic, and pepper. Chicken feet are loaded with collagen, which converts to gelatin during long cooking. The resulting broth was thick, rich, and deeply nourishing. The feet themselves could be eaten as well, and the broth became the base for soups, gravies, and rice dishes that fed the whole family. Number 8. Using buttermilk as a tenderizer and flavor agent. Buttermilk was a byproduct of churning butter and was often available to Black families who kept a cow or had access to one. Rather than drinking it plain, Big Mama used it strategically. Soaking chicken in salted buttermilk overnight broke down muscle fibers and tenderized tougher cuts that would otherwise be chewy and unsatisfying. Buttermilk and biscuit dough reacted with baking soda to create a lighter, fluffier rise without requiring expensive baking powder in large quantities. Every function of buttermilk in Depression-era black cooking was about extracting maximum results from minimal effort and minimal cost. Number 7. Cooking dried field peas with hog maw. Hog maw, which is the stomach of a pig, was another cut that no one else wanted, and that black families had been forced to cook with since slavery. During the Depression, it became a resourceful ingredient rather than simply a reminder of deprivation. Cleaned and slow-cooked with dried field peas, onions, and seasoning, hog maw added a rich, gelatinous quality to the pot and a depth of flavor that made simple field peas taste like a Sunday meal. The connective tissues in the maw released collagen that thickened the broth naturally. Number 6. Making tea from garden herbs and fruit scraps. Store-bought tea was a luxury. Big Mama brewed her own from whatever grew in the yard or remained from food preparation. Dried sassafras leaves, mint, lemon balm, dried fruit peels, and even certain roots were steeped in boiling water to create hot drinks that served both as beverages and as home remedies. Orange and lemon peels, saved from the rare occasions when citrus was available, were dried on the windowsill and kept in a jar for tea making for months afterward. Nothing with flavor or utility was discarded in these kitchens. Number 5. Making crackling bread gravy for Sunday dinner. On the rare occasions when a whole hog was butchered, a celebration version of everyday cooking happened. Grandma would collect the drippings from roasting, combine them with flour to make a roux, add water or broth slowly while stirring, and produce a silky gravy enriched with bits of crackling. This gravy was poured over everything at Sunday dinner: rice biscuits, cornbread, boiled potatoes, and even eaten with a spoon on its own. The roux technique of cooking fat and flour together before adding liquid is the foundation of every great Southern gravy, sauce, and gumbo base, and it was a daily necessity in black grandmothers' kitchens long before it became celebrated in culinary schools. Number 4. Roasting and grinding dried corn into meal. When commercial cornmeal was unavailable or unaffordable and dried corn was growing or could be traded for, Big Mama roasted dried corn kernels in a cast-iron skillet until they were deeply toasted, then ground them using a hand-turned stone mill or a heavy stone. This produced a coarser, smokier cornmeal than the commercial version, but the roasting process added a nutty depth of flavor that elevated everything from hoe cakes to cornbread to mush. This was direct knowledge carried from West African grain processing traditions applied to New World crops in American conditions. Number 3. Making molasses cake as a staple dessert. Sugar was expensive during the Depression, but blackstrap molasses was cheap because it was a byproduct of sugar refining that commercial buyers did not value highly. Black grandmothers baked dense, dark cakes sweetened entirely with molasses instead of white sugar. Blackstrap molasses is extraordinarily rich in iron, calcium, magnesium, and potassium. A single tablespoon contains more minerals than most multivitamins on the market today. Grandma was not just making dessert, she was delivering micronutrients to her family in a form that tasted like a treat, which meant everyone ate it willingly and consistently. Number 2. Smoking fish caught from local rivers and preserving it in cornmeal. Black families living near rivers, lakes, and coastal areas supplemented their food supply through fishing, which cost nothing but time. Catfish, carp, bream, and buffalo fish were smoked over hickory or pecan wood until fully dried, then stored packed in dry cornmeal inside wooden boxes or crocks. The cornmeal absorbed any residual moisture from the fish, preventing mold while also absorbing the smoky fish flavor, which made the cornmeal itself more savory and complex when eventually used for cornbread or mush. 2 preserved ingredients improving each other simultaneously inside one container. That is genius-level food science from a woman who never read a textbook. And we have arrived at number 1, making everything from nothing with red beans and rice on Monday. This is the most iconic and deeply meaningful practice in the entire tradition of Black Depression-era cooking. Monday was laundry day, the hardest working day of the week for black women who took in wash as one of the few income sources available to them during Jim Crow and the Depression. Red kidney beans were put on to soak Sunday night, then set on the stove Monday morning with a ham bone from Sunday dinner, onion, garlic, celery, bay leaf, and Creole seasoning. They cooked all day on their own while Big Mama scrubbed and wrung clothes for hours. By dinner time, those beans were thick, creamy, smoky, and deeply seasoned. Served over white rice, red beans, and rice provided complete protein because the amino acids in legumes and rice complement each other to form a full protein profile equivalent to meat. It was filling, inexpensive, nutritious, and required almost no active cooking time. This tradition is so embedded in Black Southern and Creole culture that it continues every single Monday in New Orleans. Homes to this day carried forward not as poverty food but as legacy food. A reminder that Black grandmothers fed their families with intelligence, creativity, and love under conditions that would have defeated people who did not have generations of survival knowledge behind them. Share this with someone who needs to know where their food actually came from, and come back because we are just getting started.